All right, welcome back. So last time we talked about cellular respiration and photosynthesis at just a surface basic level. This time we're going to be talking about the in-depth look at cellular respiration and how it happens. So again, just a overview. All living things need energy. The way that living things get energy is a little different depending on the type of organism. So heterotrophs get their energy by consuming food or consuming other things. And autotrophs make their own food using the sun. In our last video, we talked about the chemical equations. So cellular respiration uses glucose and oxygen to make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And photosynthesis uses carbon dioxide, water, and energy to make glucose and oxygen. These are the exact opposite equation. What goes into one comes out of the other. So the products of respiration are used to do photosynthesis, and the products of photosynthesis are used to do respiration. It's like a little cycle. Oh, and I just said this. The products of respiration are the reactants for photosynthesis and vice versa. So it's like a cycle. So cellular respiration is going to break down the bonds in glucose to release energy. So glucose is broken down in order to produce ATP during cellular respiration. The point of this process is to make ATP, which is energy, and that energy is going to be used in living things. So ATP supplies most of the energy for all living things to drive their metabolism, which is all the chemical reactions in their body. So ATP is used to drive most of the chemical reactions within a living thing. So when organic molecules such as glucose are broken down in organisms, energy or ATP is released. So ATP releases energy when one of the phosphates is broken off and the energy stored in that bond is released. And when that happens, the ATP is converted into ADP, which only has two phosphates. So ATP triphosphate means three phosphates. And there's three phosphates here in ATP. We break one off, and now we only have two. And breaking that bond releases energy. Now, this process used to make ATP is going to happen in 3 steps. So cellular respiration has 3 steps. Step 1 is called glycolysis. And glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of a cell. Step 2 is called the Krebs cycle. And this is going to happen in the matrix of the mitochondria. And then step 3 of cellular respiration is called the electron transport chain. And you will see that abbreviated ETC. And again, this happens in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. This whole process is very, very important. So here's an overview. We have glycolysis in the cytoplasm, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain within the mitochondria. This process cannot happen without the help of 2 very important electron carriers. Electron carriers carry electrons. Their job is to carry the electrons so that they can be later used to make tons and tons of ATP. And the 2 electron carriers are NADH and FADH2. So again, electron carriers are required to carry or move around electrons, which are later going to be used to make energy during the electron transport chain. And that process in which the electron carriers are used in the electron transport chain is going to be used to make a lot of ATP. So these electron carriers are very, very important in ultimately making a lot of energy for a cell. So we're going to look at the process in a bit more detail. So step 1 was glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to make 2 ATP for a cell. In this process, again, it happens out in the cytoplasm of the cell. It's called glycolysis. Glyco is glucose. Lysis means breaking down. So glycolysis is the process of breaking glucose. So what's going to happen is the 6-carbon glucose has 6 carbons, it's going to break in half. So it's going to be broken down into 2 3-carbon pyruvates. So half of a glucose is called pyruvate. So essentially glycolysis breaks glucose in half. So glycolysis breaks glucose in half. It happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. And this process does not require oxygen, so it is called anaerobic because it does not require oxygen. In order for this to happen, you have to put in a glucose. And this process is going to make 2 pyruvates. Remember, a pyruvate is half of a glucose. Since we broke it in half, we have 2 halves. 2 ATP. And this is also going to make 2 electron carriers. Remember, these are going to be important for making energy later. So that was glycolysis. So this was part 1. Moving on to part 2. Part 2 is called the Krebs cycle. It's also called the citric acid cycle. This process is going to make 2 ATP. So Krebs cycle, also known as the citric acid cycle. For those of you who like to know why, it's also known as the citric acid cycle because in this process, we're going to make a citric acid, and that's where the name comes from. This is going to happen within the mitochondria, in the matrix, and because it happens in the mitochondria, it requires oxygen. Anytime we move into the mitochondria, it requires oxygen. So what happens is the 2 pyruvates from up here move down. So you have our 2 pyruvates and oxygen to make 2 ATP, carbon dioxide, and some electron carriers. The CO2 comes from what we do is we take the 2 pyruvates and we chop off the carbons. So in the citric acid cycle, it looks like let me get down to this image. It looks like a cycle because in here we put in pyruvate. And then we slowly chop off carbons. So as we go, we chop off a carbon, we chop off another carbon, and that's where the CO2 comes from, is because we chop off the carbons. Now, this process only makes 2 ATP. Only 2 ATP. So you might be thinking, if it only makes 2, then what's the point? The point of the Krebs cycle is because it makes tons and tons of electron carriers. And remember, these electron carriers are going to be making lots and lots and lots of ATP in the end. So making the electron carriers now will pay off later. So it's kind of like putting your money in the bank. later you'll be able to use it to make more. So these electron carriers are going to go on to the third step, which is the electron transport chain. So that brings us to step 3, the electron transport chain. Here, all of the electron carriers that we've made so far is going to go to the electron transport chain. Now, just to account for what energy we've made, glycolysis made 2 ATP, the Krebs cycle made 2 ATP, and just being honest here, life requires much, much more energy than 4 ATP. Just an idea, working a muscle requires roughly 10 million ATPs a second. So contracting a muscle requires roughly 10 million ATP a second. So you are going to need way, way, way more than 4 ATP to get the job done. Therefore, the electron transport chain is very important because it's going to make the most ATP of all of the steps. And this process happens in the mitochondria. This process is aerobic. Again, in the mitochondria, it requires oxygen, so it's called aerobic. Requires air. And what happens in the electron transport chain is all of the electron carriers that we made so far go here, and they are going to be used to make ATP in a process called ATP synthesis. So we put in all of our electron carriers, which again are NADH and FADH2, as well as oxygen because we are in the mitochondria. And this is going to make roughly 34 ATPs and water as a product. So it makes tons and tons and tons of ATP. So going over it one more time. So this is just an overview. So again, there are 3 steps. We have step number 1, step number 2, and step number 3. Step number 1 is glycolysis. In glycolysis, we put in glucose. Glycolysis chops the glucose in half. We chop it in half, we make 2 pyruvates. That process makes 2 ATP and some electron carriers. These electron carriers are going to move down to step 3. We don't need them until step 3. The 2 pyruvates are going to move to step 2, which is the Krebs cycle. In the Krebs cycle, the pyruvates are broken down. The carbons are chopped off. That releases carbon dioxide and makes 2 ATP as well as electron carriers. Those electron carriers are going to move on to step 3. So all of the electron carriers that we used are now going to be moved to step 3. In step 3, the electron carriers are going to release all of their electrons. So all the electrons are going to come off. The electrons are going to run through a protein called ATP synthase, and that is going to make tons and tons and tons of ATP. So the electrons are used to make ATP. So this process makes roughly 34 ATP. We put in oxygen to make water, and it made CO2 over here, as well as tons and tons and tons of ATP. So this whole process altogether makes roughly 38 ATP total. Now, you may be wondering, well, you said it takes like 10 million a second. And the reason that this can all add up to give us enough energy is because this is happening everywhere along the mitochondria. So we talked about all the folds inside of the mitochondria. That means that this process, the electron transport chain, is happening all along the folds within one mitochondria. So one mitochondria could be doing this process hundreds of times at the same time. And one cell has many mitochondria. And your body has millions of cells. So if you take 38 ATP and multiply it by a couple of hundred in one mitochondria, and then multiply that by, let's say each cell has, 100 mitochondria. And then you multiply that by the millions of cells in your bodies, you're getting to that 10 million mark quite easily. So you may ask, what about cells that don't have a mitochondria? Because if a cell doesn't have a mitochondria, it can't go to step 2. So if a cell does not have a mitochondria, we can't proceed to step 2. So it can do glycolysis, but it can't do the Krebs cycle because there's no mitochondria. And that's going to take us into fermentation. So cells like bacteria, they don't have mitochondria. They do glycolysis. And then after glycolysis, those pyruvates are used in a different process called fermentation. So again, there are 2 types of cellular respiration. There's aerobic respiration, which is the one we just talked about, where there is oxygen and there is a mitochondria, but there's also anaerobic respiration. And that happens if there's no mitochondria or if there's no oxygen. So anaerobic means no oxygen. And there's 2 types of anaerobic respiration. There's alcoholic and lactic acid. And we're going to talk about those 2. The path that you go down depends on the type of organism you are. So a normal cell has glucose, does glycolysis in the cytoplasm, makes pyruvate. If there's oxygen in a mitochondria, you go through the process we just talked about with the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. However, if you do not have oxygen or you don't have a mitochondria, then you go into anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation. The type of organism you are is going to depend on if you do alcoholic or lactic acid fermentation. So we're going to start with alcoholic fermentation. So alcoholic fermentation is typically done by yeast and bacteria. This process is going to be what makes beer, wine, cheese, and lots of other foods. And this process is non-reversible, so you can't go back. Versus lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation is done by most animals, bacteria, and fungi. And this is what causes muscle fatigue, is lactic acid buildup. This process is reversible, and you can go back. So one way that you guys have seen lactic acid fermentation happen in your everyday lives is when you feel the burn. So if you are a runner, let's say you're a runner, you're running, you're sprinting, and you get out of breath. Not too long after you start getting out of breath, you start to feel the burn. You might feel the burn in your muscles of your legs. And the reason why you're feeling the burn is because your body isn't making enough oxygen to keep up the process of cellular respiration, to make enough energy for your muscles to keep working. So your body converts to fermentation to make energy. And that's what causes you to feel the burn. Your muscles are making lactic acid and they start to burn. But once you stop, you take a minute, you suck in some air, you get some oxygen available, you're able to get rid of the lactic acid and start normal respiration again. So it is reversible. All right, so we're going to go through these review questions at the end. So where did glucose come from? Well, glucose comes from either what you eat or if you're a plant, photosynthesis. So it depends. If you're a plant, glucose comes from photosynthesis. If you're an animal, it comes from what you eat. Number 2, where does glycolysis happen? Glycolysis happens, I'm going to go with what's on your sheet. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm of a cell. All right. Number 2, what else is produced that is not listed in this equation? Well, what else is made are your electron carriers. We never talked about those. Those aren't listed in the equation. So you also make electron carriers. Number 4, why do we breathe? Well, we breathe to get the oxygen that's required to do cellular respiration so you can make energy. That's why we breathe. Number 5, which stage of cellular respiration makes the most ATP? The most ATP comes from the electron transport chain. That process creates roughly 34 ATP. And our last question, what are the 2 types of fermentation and what are their products? So the 2 types of fermentation are going to be lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation. Alcoholic fermentation makes ethanol and CO2. Lactic acid fermentation makes lactic acid. So we're going to have some practice on all of the details of cellular respiration on Canvas.